Marlys and her efforts in this community to help document various neighborhoods, whether it's the Manville Heights or whether the flood mitigation along the Iowa River and the University of Iowa campuses. She's worked on the original history of Iowa City along with some research she helped from Shaner Magalhães way back, I guess, 15, 20 years ago? I don't know how long ago. But they were spending time in the trenches, looking at that microfilm I referred to, looking at the newspapers and the city directories, uncovering the evidence that's brought us here to today. Marlys got her degree from Luther College, went on to work for the Office of Historic Preservation, which was part of the State Historical Society. At that time, they were located in Old Brick, the Presbyterian Church over here. She has worked on a lot of mitigation efforts, which means that when the property disappears or is obliterated, there has to be some authentic documentation that goes on so that we have a picture in our mind's eye of what that building was about. She is going to educate us today about what's been going on with all the university and with the Sabin School properties. And so join me in welcoming Marlys today. Thank you.
This could become a pat each other on the back program, but I won't do that because we don't have enough time. I would note, however, that my move to Iowa City back in 1976 was to be employed in the basement of McLean Hall. That's where the Historic Preservation Office was at that time. Short time later, in the midst of all the discussions about what was going to happen with Old Brick, plans were put to work for saving it. But in the meantime, they needed more space in McLean Hall, so they moved us to another location. It was in my office. My desk was placed in the area next to the old snack food section in the A&P store. Or the new Pioneer Co-op. And inevitably, when I go in the co-op these days, I always find one of those young millennials that's staffing the aisles, and I say, do you know where the snack food section used to be? And they look at me like, we don't have snack foods anymore. And I point out, well, I used to have my office there. Occasionally they engage me in further conversation, but sometimes they just nod their head politely to that senior shopper and walk away down the hall. Inevitably, however, there's a point in all of this. We moved to Old Brick, our office did, and in the course of about a 6-8 month time period, I wandered through those 3 buildings in Iowa City. And they're a part of the early story of my life, the way wandering through buildings for all of us is a part of our lives. So today we're going to talk a little bit about salvaging history for the future. I tried to cross out salvaging and convert it into saving after I got done with this PowerPoint presentation, but it wouldn't let me do it. So salvaging, saving, they may have a common root somewhere. It's just how you look at it. So consider this saving history for the future as well as salvaging it. Today's topics are going to involve a look back at historic preservation in Iowa City from those years when I started here in 1976. We're going to look at a few of the outstanding points along the way from me. One was coming to Iowa City to do the city's first historic preservation plan to be incorporated into its comprehensive plan in 1992. And then they invited me back to do an update about 15 years later, and that plan update was finally approved in 2008. So I'll talk a little bit about those, what they were all about, how they worked, what worked well, what could have worked better. Then I'll talk a little bit about the neighborhood historical surveys I've been involved with, beginning in 1993 all the way up through 2015. Historic districts, the National Register, individual nominations and historic district nominations, and local designations of historic districts and individual landmarks. Finally, my current work takes me to the field of disasters. I'll talk about that. And here in Iowa City, that certainly means your tornado, fires of different scale, and floods, most recently the 2008 flood. So that's what I'm going to talk about. The first comprehensive plan was a product that grew out of the city wanting to get their hands around what they'd been doing in historic preservation, how they could maybe do it better. They were at a crossroads. They'd had 2 historic districts listed as local landmark districts, and they couldn't get any further. They couldn't persuade people. They couldn't make a case for what they had been doing well or what they had been doing less than perfect. So during 1991 and 1992, they hired me to put together a strategic plan for historic preservation. Doug Russell later told me that one of the reasons they hired me, I was just down the road, at least 50 miles away, so they'd believe what I said. And the other reason was I was a young consultant. And he knew that I would give them more than what they were paying me to do. And he was right. You got your money's worth. And in the end, what I decided after having lived in Iowa City earlier in my life and then worked in Davenport as a preservation planner for a number of years, what I wanted to do is come back and help you look at this plan as a way to live up to a mission. And that mission for me was to conserve old buildings in order to make a good community better, because that's what Iowa City was at that time. It was a good community, aspired to as a residential location for thousands of Iowans who returned here as former alumni or came here because they knew it was a good place to get medical care, any number of reasons. But conserving its older buildings was part of making that good community better. We came up with 10 principal goals, had more than 100 citywide and neighborhood objectives, and the planning process included a variety of measures that I had been involved with in other strategic planning efforts. We had a series of very well-attended neighborhood meetings. There was always 25 to 50 people in attendance. We had a packed citywide bus tour on a Saturday. I believe it was a city bus that took us throughout all the neighborhoods. We did an opinion survey in all the central Iowa City neighborhoods where older buildings were located, and we got a great response. I forget what it was, but it was in the upper two figures, upper teens, I should say, in terms of the number of opinions surveys we had returned. So we knew what people thought, but we wanted to know in even greater depth, so we did interviews. We did interviews, I think, with probably about 40 people in a wide range of opinions throughout the community. And we came up with a series of goals. I won't talk about these a lot. You're welcome to look at that preservation plan. It's still on the shelves in the public library, and you can get a look at the update online, I believe. Bob, can you still get a look at? You can still get a look at the updated plan online. And these were the same basic goals that went in the first plan and were included in the second plan. Identifying historic resources. We knew where a few of them were here in the community, but what about all the others? To try to adopt a municipal policy that would protect historic resources. And that's not just singular policy, but plural policies. We wanted to find a way to develop and promote economic incentives, to provide technical assistance from the staff to members of the community on how to preserve. We wanted to find a way to inform the public better regarding historic preservation, because we knew if they were informed, they would invest their own hard-earned cash. I look at this meeting today as a good example of informing the public about not only historic preservation, but local history. We wanted to find a way to strengthen partnerships between various government levels so that we could take advantage of and encourage each other partner, the state, the federal agencies involved in a community, to do the right thing in terms of preservation. We wanted to find ways to promote preservation on and around the university campus, a very big issue when we started this discussion in 1991-92. We wanted to find a way to promote heritage tourism, to review and evaluate our historic preservations on a regular basis. We wanted the HPC to not just do a plan and sit back and wait for it to happen. We wanted them to look at it every year and say, what's new? What do we need to do different? What's on that list of tasks for us to undertake this year? And then, probably the largest section of the plan, we wanted the plan to adopt a series of neighborhood-based preservation strategies. What would be one thing in the north side could be quite different along Kirkwood. We wanted Summit Avenue to have its own strategies, and we wanted the downtown to have its own strategies. So those were the basic goals we were looking at. We wanted to do all this, but we had to get the city council to buy in. So there was a dramatic end to the process, and it came in December 1992. Rumors had it, and they were all afoot in this town, as you well know how rumors spread, that the plan was going to be contested, that there would be opposition, no votes on the council. Approval was in question. Well, we were all worried, as Iowa Cityans know how to worry. I don't know any better community for worrying. But they worried. And that was a good thing because it meant, to my surprise, that dozens of supporters showed up in the city council chambers that night. People I had never met, people who had not attended one of our neighborhood meetings. And remember, in 1992, I don't think the city even had an online website. How did they find out? Well, they found out by talking to one another through neighborhood organizations that were passing the word, through the venerable use of landline phone calls. That's how they all knew to show up at that meeting. And they spoke with clarity, as public speakers always do in Iowa City. And I will never forget the response that the city council had that night, because it was very positive. The plan was adopted unanimously. And we thought it might not get approved. So that tells you worry can do good things. It can make you go beyond the measures maybe that are necessary, but in the end, the city adopted the plan, and that was a very good thing because it meant that the plan, which had three big sections, the plan, a set of an executive summary, and then all the appendices, that we would be able to move on to implementing those. There were about 100 objectives that were set forth. Those are measurable, remember, so we had set a measuring stick to tell us when we would have achieved our objectives. They could be measured. Completing a survey, passing a piece of legislation, they were measurable. We looked at, as a first project, the development of a national register and local listing for the Brown Street Historic District. That's actually what had gotten all of this started. Doug isn't here in the room today, is he? Well, he happened to live in the Brown Street neighborhood, and that was partly why I think he was especially motivated as a resident of that neighborhood to undergo the efforts to get the Brown Street Historic District listed on the National Register and made into a local landmark district. He undertook the leadership to get HPC members out there talking to their neighbors. I believe there was some kind of postcard initiative to demonstrate the support of individuals who lived in the neighborhood so that the city council couldn't object, saying we don't think there's support for this. There was demonstrated support by the time that project got done. I wrote the district nomination, and it was a great one to see get approved. So all of that was approved. All those goals and initiatives were underway, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that work, but I wanted to take you to the next step of the preservation plan, and that was an update that occurred in 2006, 2007. And again, there had been measurable progress on almost all fronts. And the new one was also unanimously adopted by the City Council. We had another series of neighborhood meetings. Staff was actively involved. And one of the first plan initiatives that came out of the new plan was a heightened focus on neighborhoods that had not been addressed with historical and architectural surveys in the first 15 years. And the first survey that was done following the adoption of the new plan was the Manville Heights survey. So all of the things that were in those two plans can sort of be summarized as if you look at the preservation plan through the lens of neighborhood historical surveys. Specific areas were identified. We established priorities for completion over the first 10 years in the first plan, and then added another 10 years in the second plan. Grants were sought and received. Consultants were retained, not just myself, but many others. In that time period between 1993 and 2009, 13 neighborhood surveys were completed. That's pretty amazing. I know that because I've done survey work all over the state. The first effort that was undertaken was the preparation of what we call a cover document or a historic context document. And that was to lay out the history of Iowa City broadly so that future nominations for individual buildings or districts could refer back to that history and say, we're part of that larger context of Iowa City history. So I had the pleasure of working on that and seeing that multiple property document, or what we refer to as an MPD, submitted to the National Register of Historic Places. And we were really pleased with that in 1994 to have it listed. By 2006, there were 8 National Register Historic Districts approved. Remember, there had been 2 listed on the National Register in Iowa City proper. not including the Pentacrest. But in 1992, there were two neighborhood districts, Summit Street and Woodlawn were both listed. So those are the first two, and then after 93, 94, Brown Street, College Green, East College, Longfellow neighborhood, the Jefferson Street district, the Melrose, and the Northside. So those were all National Register nomination eligible districts that were made their way through the Local Preservation Commission, and most of them had a consultant involved and found their way onto the National Register. So by 2015, there are 13 historic and conservation districts approved, because Iowa City decided that the definition of a historic district didn't cover what was found in many of the older neighborhoods. They fell into another category of significance, that is a conservation district. Not simply historic, maybe with less integrity for some of the buildings, but nevertheless a sense of neighborhood. Those became conservation districts. So in 2015, 13 historic and conservation districts. Wow. I think that's something to be incredibly proud of. And I've had something to do with a few of these along the way, but they've mainly been the Historic Preservation Commission, the city staff, and people like yourselves who've been leaders and supporters. And it's taken the votes of Historic Preservation Commissions, Plan and Zone Commissions, and city councils to make them happen. So, a few observations. There's been diverse and changing leadership in Iowa City, and historic preservation has withstood the test, the support of all of that diversity and all of that changing leadership. And I don't see any reason why that can't happen into the future. I know you're Iowa Cityans, so you worry and you think the last preservationist has found his way through the city council or through the city manager's position. That isn't the case. History will be here in the future. You're saving it right now. You will have leaders who will tie into that leadership down the road. I think there has been too little time spent in celebrating success. Iowa is extremely respected as a preservation community around the state, and you all should be very proud of that. What you're doing this afternoon with the coordination of the Friends of Historic Preservation and the Historic Preservation Commission is to celebrate success. And it needs to be celebrated whenever you have an opportunity, whenever you can find a way to bend the ear of a writer for the newspaper or somebody who's putting together a film documentary, that sort of thing. That's when you need to promote and celebrate your success. And always smile. There's a lot of preservationists in this community who are not known for smiling very much because they're always being defensive. They need to be positive. One of the best things that's happened that I've observed over time is that the university is becoming a historic preservation player. Whether it's preserving buildings like the Isolation Hospital across the street from us that used to be scheduled for demolition in some unknown time in the future, or whether it's taking a leadership role in literally a dozen projects on the campus right now that involve mitigating the loss of historic resources to the flood of 2008. They are taking a historic preservation leadership role. And I think you need to commend and to thank them and keep them on task, being a preservation advocate. One of the things I've observed about Iowa City is when I first started working here that a lot of people said everybody in Iowa City wants to build on the edge of town. They're abandoning the central city neighborhoods to students-only housing, and upkeep is poor, all the negative things that could possibly be said. Well, I think housing trends in Iowa City are now paralleling those of the nation. That is, historic older residential neighborhoods located within walking distance of businesses, many of those which are housed in older buildings, are now being favored for entry-level and back to the city housing. Young and old buyers, house preservers, they're there, and they're all over the neighborhoods in the city. As I showed you that map of where the historic districts are, that's one of the reasons they're there. In 1993, that was just an idea. It was beginning, but it was not the reality that it is today in 2015. Now, there's another neighborhood that we had looked at for study, recommended in the preservation plan in 2008 as a next neighborhood, one of several next neighborhoods to be studied. One of them was the Manville Heights neighborhood, and we've done a neighborhood survey in that neighborhood. Another one was the Southside neighborhood. That is now, I would observe in looking at what's going on in Iowa City, more than the crisis of the hour, preserving buildings in that neighborhood. But it's really the last chapter for urban renewal, which began 50 years ago here. What's going to happen in that neighborhood? I don't know. But I just would observe, for the historian, it's part of that urban renewal continuum. So, what about the disasters? Well, here in Iowa City, that has meant, among other things, a tornado, multiple fires, and several floods. Let's look at the tornado first. I got a call on the morning of April 15th by Bob Miklo to tell me that there had been a tornado that had come through town overnight. And he didn't know what was going to happen. So many neighborhoods had been affected. It had just missed the Johnson County Courthouse, but it had taken out St. Patrick's, or much of St. Patrick's. It had taken out a building that the Historic Preservation Commission was talking about moving that night. You all know that story, and you couldn't have had a more profound experience for the HPC members as they hovered in the basement of, as I believe in, was it in Civic Center? And thinking about what was going on all around them. Well, the two photos on the left are examples of what happened. This was a conservation district, not a historic district, but there were still some design controls over what would happen in that neighborhood. The photo on the top was taken right after the storm, and the photo below is what happened with good, prompt design review and intensive technical assistance provided by staff and members of the HBC. That photo is 2 years later, so 2006, 2008. The 2006 photo is when we started having all of our public meetings in the community for the preservation plan, and the only thing people wanted to talk about was the tornado. And I'll never forget the first meeting at Longfellow School. I just decided, go with it. So we spent that night talking about the tornado, and we sympathized with people who were there, who had lost their house right on Iowa Avenue, and we talked about what could be done as measures to help these people after the tornado. But it was a disastrous event. And I like to think this city came through with a real competent response in terms of its older buildings, its historic resources. If you look at the slide on the left, that was again in 2006. On the right, 2008. The building on the left in each of those photos never had its 2 coats of paint removed, or its coat of paint and the raw brick removed. It still has the quirkiness of being an Iowa City historic building. But nevertheless, it's standing for someday when somebody might decide to remove that paint sensitively and go back to an all brick building. But you do see that the building on the right in each of those photos did have its hip roof restored, had the porch rebuilt as it had been, a brick porch, and really a nice design with assistance from the city. Then there was the fire. And there were multiple fires that occurred here. The Bruegger's Bakery site fire, you know, the Iowa City's first public library location. That building is gone, but Bruegger's is still here. And then there were other disasters that were self-made, like the demolition of the old funeral home that's now an office tower in the downtown. In any case, fires, again, were dramatic. This one on November 20th at Old Capitol, I didn't get this particular image, but I had a photo sent to me while the Capitol was still burning. Somebody took the time, they knew I would care, and all I could do was follow the news after that and see what was transpiring. Of course, good things happened. I wasn't surprised, you probably weren't surprised, but the whole building could have gone, folks. It didn't, thanks to the fire department and their proximity to the fire, and thanks to the fact that the building was built well to begin with. You know, that limestone was still going to be there when they got done, and fortunately they kept it from spreading down through the entire roof into the main building. In case other such events happen in the future, you'll be able to collect them under the category of natural and less than natural disasters. for fires, tornadoes, and floods. The flooding on the university campus is certainly what struck me in 2008. I was just finishing a major project in Cedar Rapids, had documented 1,500 buildings with photos and preparing site inventory forms for each of them. I'd worked with Tim Weitzel. He'd been doing all the photography on the project. Tim had been the president of the Iowa City HPC. That's how we got to know each other. In any case, up there in Cedar Rapids, I knew what was going on, but I hadn't really known exactly what was going on until I was hired by Iowa Homeland Security later in 2008. But what happened in that flood was not just here in Iowa City, it was not just in Cedar Rapids. Totally, we think the damage was between $5 and $10 billion statewide. We know that over 10,000 residences were flooded, and of those, 1,700 were demolished. All these projects received historic preservation review. The University of Iowa has had more than 400 projects with FEMA damage assistance, almost $500 million for the recovery. Far less than the total loss for the university, however, and they will be glad to tell you exactly how much when all of this is done. The estimated FEMA investment in Iowa from that flood was $1.6 billion. Now, when you hear about disasters around the country being $5 billion here, $3 billion there, whatever, this is the largest Iowa disaster, and we deserve to get every penny of it because we need every penny of it to recover. It was a life-changing event for thousands, including myself. I'd worked for the city of Cedar Rapids, as I said, and during the summer of 2008, just as I was delivering to the city my final survey of the Youngs Hill neighborhood, the flood came about 2 weeks later. I eventually joined Iowa Homeland Security after working briefly for the city of Cedar Rapids to help them get up to speed, but then joined Iowa Homeland Security to assist. The purpose of my job was going to be to evaluate and document historic buildings and neighborhoods lost around the state, some here in Iowa City, and at the University of Iowa campus. I came to stay for 18 months. That's all they hired me for. But I ended up staying for 6 years, and soon will be departing. As a result of the 2008 flood, there were 5,200 flood-affected dwellings in eastern Iowa that were damaged, another 4,300 just in Cedar Rapids. We developed an approach that had never been used by FEMA before. It was an approach that we call reconnaissance surveys or windshield surveys. That is a quick look at a neighborhood just by looking at the buildings in it and making preliminary determinations about which buildings appear to meet National Register criteria and have sufficient integrity to withstand the test of scrutiny. We did that in each of the towns, the 37 towns that were affected, and here at the university campus. Between December of 2008 and April of 2009, we did the reconnaissance surveys, as I said, in 37 venues. Now, this was a new approach because usually FEMA would have waited at least 2 years before they evaluated the significance of buildings for historic or National Register eligibility. But our approach said, let's look at them all right up front, find out the ones that have no resources and clear them to move ahead, instead of waiting 2 years to evaluate all their buildings in a very slow schedule. So we cleared eventually, initially 14 of the 37 communities. We found them to not have any historic resources, and the Iowa State Historical Society's State Historic Preservation Office agreed with us. Those communities had no further review and got on with recovery after April of 2009. I didn't know what a big deal this was until several years later when my bosses politely told me that it would have been only now that we would have been starting to clear some of those communities. FEMA apparently thought it was a good idea too, because when Sandy hit in the Northeast, I started getting calls from New Jersey and New York about what we had done here in Iowa and how they could make it work in their communities. It's now being used. I talked to the folks in Colorado just last summer when they were trying to figure out a way to get on top of their flood losses. So we were ahead of what we needed to be done, needed to have done, and I like to think it was because I brought a consultant's perspective to it, which was get the work done, get on to another project so you can get paid. And that is never what's behind, excuse the public employees in the room, that's never what's behind public employees. They get paid whether they get done with the work or not. They just put it off into another fiscal year. So we had 23 remaining towns in outstate areas, however, and we identified nearly 600 buildings that were National Register eligible, and 17 historic districts contained most of those. In the process, along with Justine Zimmer, who now resides here in Iowa City and was a native of Iowa City at the time, we did 13,000 photographs, and we prepared Iowa site inventory forms, either in our office or through a couple of consultants for all 600 buildings. Most of the neighborhoods here in Iowa City that were affected by the flood were newer neighborhoods, or they were neighborhoods that had many altered buildings, such as, or a lot of trailer houses and modified riverfront properties that had been changed through the years and had no historical architectural significance. But in Iowa City, a couple of buildings did surface. One of the buildings that surfaced that certainly everybody already knew about, that was National Register significant, was the Ned Ashton House down on Park Road. It eventually ended up being a City of Iowa City property, and we were glad to see a good resolution to its flooding situation. But there were a few others. One was on the opposite side of the Iowa River, downstream of the Ashton House, and this was 305 Taft Speedway, shown here at the right. It was in the process of being elevated in this particular view, but the building, a good example of a gambrel roof-styled colonial revival cottage, was intact. Another one right next door was 103 Taft Speedway, and this one shown here was the Trimble House. Ossie and Janet Trimble, some of you may know them here in town, had built this house back in the 1960s, 1966 to be exact, and it was a well-preserved example of the blending of two vernacular house forms during that period, the ranch and the rambler, along with a split-level form. Now, 1966, and the flood occurred in 2008. It was just 50 years old, so we wanted to, or right around the 50-year cutoff for buildings, but nevertheless it was quite intact, and this is what it looked like when we first saw it. They were still residing there, and or about to leave residing there, and the design itself was a product of a self-taught woman. Janet did the design for the house, and Ossie built it. We didn't know that when we identified it as a significant property. Now, its construction had followed the completion of the Coralville Dam back in 1958. It was a rare early example of a year-round riverfront home. When you think about it, until that point, everybody thought the river would flood, including the University of Iowa, which is why none of those buildings, eventually built in the 1970s or late 60s and 70s, were ever constructed. They were waiting to see whether the river really wasn't going to flood. But the Trimbles moved ahead in 1966, built the house, and we felt this was a good building to document thoroughly at the end of this project. So to mitigate its loss, as Mary was saying, one of the projects we did here in Iowa City was to thoroughly document this building, prepare major drawings and plans for it. I did interviews with the Trimbles, researched a number of elements about the history of the property. A copy of the site form for this building is now in Mary's collection, and Mrs. Trimble occasionally comes back to say hello, and not too long ago I updated the site form for her. She wanted to share it again with family members, so she copied it off and sent out CDs to everybody who would be interested. So we're getting different in how we do our history, but that was a good thing. The university campus itself was something else that had to be evaluated to determine which buildings that had flooded or suffered loss were National Register eligible. We worked on this for about 6 weeks, and by the end of January I'd come up with a reconnaissance survey that had determined that the River Valley portion of the campus was indeed National Register eligible as a historic district based on both historic and architectural significance, despite the fact that many of the buildings within that campus area were less than 50 years old. They qualified for special consideration because of the quality of their architects, and we were able to have good discussions with the National Park Service about this issue, as well as the State Historic Preservation Office. And everybody agreed that it was indeed a National Register eligible district. So the period of significance began in 1905 when the Olmsted brothers had done a campus plan, and it extended all the way through Hampshire's completion in 1971-72. And that was beyond the 50-year cutoff, but everybody agreed this was in fact a historic campus section. Now there are two other parts of the campus that are already National Register listed. One includes historic buildings along Jefferson Street that are part of the East Jefferson Street Historic District, and the other district is the Pentacrest itself, including Old Capitol and the balance of the Pentacrest. So this became the third part of the university campus. In this case, it wasn't listed on the National Register. It was simply determined eligible for listing at some future point. Just to get you acquainted, we're talking about new buildings here, folks, and we're talking about nationally significant architects. Architects who were retained beginning in the 1960s, and at the top, Max Abramowitz's work. He had done Avery Fisher Hall in New York City. He had done the big campus facility at the University of Illinois. And he and his partners did many skyscrapers and important buildings, part of the UN complex. All of these were done by Abramowitz. Other buildings that came later, Sabin Hall's building, the Art Building West, and the Geary building in the lower right corner. Some of these are still subject to consideration as to whether or not they're really good architecture. But that's what should happen when new architecture gets designed. There should be question and query. And here at the university, you've got at least 10,000 opinions about everything. So I think that's good. I didn't used to really think much of Hampshire myself until I was working on this project and looked at the subtleties. When we looked at photographs that were taken in documenting the building before it went down, and we looked at those entrance stairs in the front lobby, and we looked at how that staircase was constructed, rising to the second floor, curving at the same time. It was just edging to the left and right, and my photographer was able to, a university photographer, was able to capture that on her phone, in her film. We were just thrilled with the subtlety of that design that we were able to capture. That's all been retained in documentation. And I should point out that one of the next things that's going to happen is as a part of a mitigation measure for the loss and the relocation of Old Hampshire to the new Hampshire site is going to be a film. A film is being made by a local film company, and it will hearken back to the early years of the construction of university structures on the campus along the river valley, and it'll take us all the way up through the final years, including the coming of the flood. These buildings were really important. The Public Works Administration construction that occurred during the 1930s. This part of the structure just to the north of Iowa Memorial Union, the class fountain, and the entrance stairs to the Memorial Bridge. And then there's the building on the other side of the river. I'm so glad I don't have to show you a photo of what the building used to look like. This is a historic view in the lower right, and this is what it looks like now. We took off all the insensitive additions, and now it's back to what it looked like when it was originally constructed. The photo in the left corner here is a photo I took inside the building. The photo in the upper right is a historic photo taken in a similar lobby location. And I bring those to your attention because there are many parts of the interior of this building which is going to be preserved, by the way, with a new use. We don't know what that use will be, but in any case, the building has been salvaged and it's going to be preserved. A feasibility is being done right now for how it will be adaptively reused by the university. If there are calls to attend meetings to offer opinions about that reuse, please attend. The university is open to your ideas and wants to do good things for this building. The historic district extends all the way south as far as the hydraulics laboratory building and the power plant, as well as the dam. And you can walk under that dam. I've got some great photos of the interior of that walkway space. Part of the heating tunnel system that was coming out of the power plant comes right underneath that particular dam structure. So all of these became part of that historic district that extended from Park Road to Burlington, from River Drive to Madison Street, in the facing buildings on the east side of Madison. Another project the University of Iowa got involved with as a part of relocating the music buildings, Clapp and Voxman, was to find a new place for a new music building complex. And they selected a site along Burlington. You all know where that is. And part of that selection meant they were buying out the bank site. The bank needed a new place to go, and it was eventually determined that the bank wanted to be on the Henry Sabin School site. So that's how I got involved with documentation for Henry Sabin School. As you've probably read in the newspapers, this school will be raised. The date looks like sometime next summer. What I was interested in doing was, as our obligation of National Historic Preservation Law, it's to document buildings that are going to have an adverse effect. Well, demolishing a building is definitely an adverse effect. So I started out with researching in a variety of sources and discovered that when the first discussion by the school board was held in 1916 for construction of 3 new elementary schools in town. Actually, there were going to be 4, but one of them was going to be designed by a local architect by the name of Carpenter. You might know his name. The other 3, they were going to hire an outside consultant, and that ended up being George Lockhart, and he had his offices in St. Paul at the time. He got the contract to build 3 new schools, and he opened up an office in Iowa City for a period of time. This was one of the drawings that he did initially for the new, it hadn't been given a name yet, it was just the First Ward School, what became Henry Sabin School. This is what the building looked like shortly after it was constructed. This photo came to me. The only place I found a historic photo of this building, from right across the hall, Mary Bennett, she had a copy of the photo of the building. The school district didn't have any copies. You'd think they would, but they didn't. Nobody had any copies, and the only thing I had from the newspaper was the line drawing, and that was a little fuzzy. This was the real thing, and this is a beautiful photo that we were able to reproduce in another project I'll tell you about in just a minute. My first task was to prepare an Iowa site inventory form about the history of Henry Sabin School. Well, it was named for Henry Sabin, and some of you may know him by his history here in education in Iowa. He had served 2 terms as the state superintendent of public instruction, and he was a highly respected Midwest educator. He believed, and I think this is really a good summary by one of his biographers, that well-conducted public schools help train citizens with moral integrity, encouraged successful representative government, and promoted a flourishing economy. That's almost a quote, but a little bit of a paraphrase. But this is Henry Sabin. He had been superintendent of schools in Clinton before he took this position here in Iowa. He's not a native of Iowa, but he fell in love with rural schools and rural housing, or rural schools, consolidated schools. All those issues became his issues during these years that he served as superintendent on the state level. He had another building named after him, one that's still standing. His life extended until 1918. That's the year that First Ward School was completed. That's when they named it after him, the year he died. But there's another one, Sabin Hall. This is on the University of Northern Iowa campus. And I have a historic photo of the building soon after it was constructed, and I include the modern day photo, even though it's a pretty nasty photo of the building. But it's a reminder to all of us, don't put ugly things in front of historic buildings. Or at the very least, provide a long view of the historic building without that piece of new construction in front of it. I won't talk about the skywalk in the downtown and how it keeps people from seeing the old Jefferson Hotel. I just won't talk about that. You can go out and walk up Dubuque Street and look down and observe it without me describing what that skywalk does. And I know not everybody agrees with me in the room about that skywalk, but it's something to be cautious about. This is a photo I just found, believe it or not, last night. It was in the Cedar Rapids Gazette, and this is back in 1982, shortly after the school was abandoned as an elementary school and taken over as administrative offices. But the great thing about this one is the wonderful, these are second generation photos, or second generation windows. They're not the first generation that had multi-lights in the upper section, but they're better than what's there now, but these were there in 1982. The point of all of this is windows make a building, and in this building they made it, the new ones in place now are so ugly that nobody could think of doing anything with it but demolishing it. However, there are other parts that have survived. As I said before, it was built in 1917, 1918. Architect George Lockhart. It was one of 3 World War I era schools in Iowa City. Longfellow and Horace Mann were the other 2 that he designed. It's a great example of the Gothic Revival style. It became popular at the turn of the century and in some places was known as Collegiate Gothic. The building still has a good long view of it, and both north and south ends are of interest as well. The entrances themselves are identical, and if you look at these 2 photos long enough, you'll see that they aren't the same entrance. It took me a while to figure that out, because you can never look at them at the same time. You have to take photos of them to compare them. And it took me till I was putting together the Iowa Site inventory form before I realized, hey, those are the same entrance. And sure enough, they are. Now, Lockhart designed other schools around Iowa, Minnesota, and Michigan, especially a large group across northern Iowa counties. And they included rural communities like Armstrong, Iowa, up in Emmett County, Belmont, Buffalo Center, Carpenter, Grundy Center, Helfa, Nevada, Rolfe, and Sheldon. Anybody in the room from any of those communities? Not until researching Sabin School did I realize that my community, Armstrong, the school that I went to school in and graduated from, was one that was designed by George Lockhart. So history comes around. You know, there's bookends in one's lives, I feel, and the bookend for me was graduating from a Lockhart school, and probably the last project I'll be working on with his historic feature in Iowa in public employment will be a school designed by Lockhart. Longfellow School, also 1917, and Horace Mann School. And what you begin to see here is that what was of interest in all these buildings, they all have the same form, but they all had very interesting, unique entrances. And in doing more research on Lockhart, I discovered that he designed a fine, unique entrance for a building on the campus of the University of Chicago in this same time period, right after this. He designed houses, or designed entrances for houses that were being designed by other architects. In other words, entrances was his love, and we've got fine examples of them here in Iowa City. So how are we going to commemorate this as a part of the loss of Sabin School? Well, we're going to do what are called historic signs or kiosks. In this case, the kiosk is going to be located in the new river crossing park down along the river in the south side. And this is what you're looking at here is part of a kiosk design under construction. I haven't finished it, but this is the part that's done. And it's going to talk about the school entrance designs that he designed for these buildings. The first one at the top is Longfellow School. That's a sketch, a photo, and 2 of the entrances. And then Horace Mann School with one of those sketches again that he did. He wrote a book, by the way, about building public schools and the need for good ventilation and light and space, growing size for a growing number of students in the World War I period. And lo and behold, those were the things that probably got him the job here in Iowa City. He finished his design work here in Iowa City and incorporated plans and drawings of the buildings here in Iowa City into that book, along with all those other schools I was talking about a few minutes ago. So one of the kiosks we're designing will commemorate the loss of Sabin School, and the other one will commemorate other buildings that are still standing in Iowa City that are reminders of Lockhart's work. The third side of the kiosk, the park folks are going to have designed will talk about the history of the River Crossing Park site. So all of these things come together, and here we are at the end of my work, still underway as you see here. And this gives you a little bit of an idea of why I'm interested in Iowa City. I've been here for close to 30 years and moved here in '76. Didn't work for the state until 1979 when I moved out of the area for a while, and then started coming back to work here in 1991. So that's been my time from '91, and since I just can't get out of this town. People are always sending me emails with questions or seeing if I'd be interested in another project. And there are literally dozens of projects I've worked on here in Iowa City that I've not talked about today. So if there's any of those that you know of, that you're interested in, have a question about, or any of the things that I've talked about this today, this noon hour, please ask your questions. Thank you.
Marlys, if you flip back to the picture of Sabin that has the barrier in front of it that was the modern picture, can I tell you that having worked, my office was here working for the school district, that entrance right there, because it was hidden, when they put the air conditioners in, that entrance also had a mail slot next to it, and for a long time the people that worked on first floor could smell smoke, like cigarettes, and would hear funny things and could not figure out what was going on. And it wasn't for almost a year that they realized a homeless person had reached through the mail slot and pushed the bar on the door open, and that stairway was walled off. So it was a triangular piece with steps under it, and somebody had lived there for probably nearly a year while we were still in the building.
Well, there have been many historic buildings that have unusual such stories, and I always point out that all buildings need vigilant touring by the staff who regularly uses them. Enough said.
Thanks, Marlys. Another exciting part of, well, if a mitigation is ever exciting, but in addition to the kiosks about Sabin, the Historic Preservation Commission requested that the arches, at least one,
No, all three
of them, will be removed. Not an easy job, and set
These
up
as
in.
well.
Sorry?
These two as well.
Yeah, and set up somewhere in the new Riverfront Crossings Park. So that's something that we requested, and FEMA agreed to do that.
Exactly. Work on that has progressed to the point where I've met with the Park and Recreation Director, and Bob is aware and has been following along what's been going on, and they know what is coming. They know that the new arch entrance, which will be at the foot of Clinton Street, can't be constructed for a couple of years yet. So we've made arrangements with a university architect who will be supervising their removal from the building. They will be palletized and sent down to be stored at the Park and Recreation Department site. And we've given them special caution to be very careful when they move them, that they don't damage them, because they're going to be taking not just these two entrances, but the main entrance and the signage that says Henry Sabin above the door. All of that carved stone will be saved, salvaged, and rebuilt, reused, one way or the other.
Great news to have a physical, tangible reminder of what that building was about. You know, Marlys is really one of my heroes. I've known her, I think, at least 35 years. But you know, when you're a consultant and your home base is Wisconsin, you don't really have a group of coworkers that you anchor with day by day. But she is on the verge of retirement, and she's been a tremendous public servant. And so let's all give her a round of applause for all of that.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. That's very kind of you. I do consider Iowa City at least my second home, if not maybe my third home, now that I spent a lot of time in Des Moines and have gotten to have a residence in location there. But there's not a time I come back to Iowa City that I don't see something wonderful to enjoy and hear about. And even if it's a problem, it's got an upside in its resolution. And that's the way I like to think about preservation. It's how to solve problems, make sense for all those people who want to, not all those young millennials who maybe don't do everything else right in their lives, but they certainly are choosing the right kind of housing to live in. They want to live in old buildings, in old warehouses. They want that. And their grandparents want to get rid of the grass mowing and the snow shoveling, and they want to live in a warehouse district too. And as I said, they want to live near young people who look like their grandchildren. And sometimes that means they live in shared housing space. And that's really good. So I like to think that coming back to Iowa City has helped me keep young and be aware of all the new people who are coming down the line in the preservation field. So thank you again, folks.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.